Good morning. On behalf of this year's organizers of the Popcorn Forum, I welcome you to North Idaho College. A collaboration of 13 organizations, including 8 regional colleges, this year's Popcorn Forum, the 33rd annual, is the most ambitious ever planned. The theme, Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. Today, Thursday, the issue is the use of public policy, law, and the courts to confront hate. And this morning, I am honored to have the privilege of introducing our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Gregory Carr. Now, time limits my introduction of Mr. Carr's credentials, but briefly, he holds a bachelor's degree in history from Utah State, a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's had an extremely successful business career. He co-founded and served as the CEO of Boston Technology Incorporated and chairman of Prodigy Incorporated, a global internet service provider. He serves on many boards and is the advisory board chair for the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. And you no doubt have heard Mr. Carr's name mentioned when a year ago the Carr Foundation deeded the Hayden Lake property once used by the Aryan nations to the North Idaho College Foundation to be operated as a peace park. And Mr. Carr is a major contributor to our own Human Rights Education Foundation. Oh, one last thing. Mr. Carr is an Idaho boy. The youngest of 7 children, Mr. Carr was born and raised in Idaho Falls. What a success story. In his life, he has done very well. And now he does what is good for human rights. His address, Erasing Hate, a Global Challenge. May I present Mr. Greg Carr.
Thank you, Mona. It's great to be here. I was thinking as I rode in last night, it's about the 5th or 6th time I've been to Coeur d'Alene in the last couple of years, and it's just a wonderful pleasure to come. I see a lot of friends in the audience that I've made in the last couple of years, and it's great. So it's this morning's topic, law and public policy in the justice system. I'm going to talk a little bit about the early origins of those institutions. I'm going to go back 2,500 years. Let's all go together to Athens, Greece, in the 5th century BC. Now, all of you have heard about Athens 2,500 years ago. These are the people who invented democracy. Probably the most important century in the history of our Earth. In that 100-year period, in that small town of Athens, and by the way, let me stop for a moment to give a sense of the size of that town. Greater Athens was probably about the same as Greater Coeur d'Alene. The number of people in Kootenai County and surrounding counties, for instance, probably about the same number of people who lived in Athens, Greece at that time. So we're not talking about a really large population. But in that relatively small town, living at the same time in that century, were the following people. We had the inventors of Western philosophy. Socrates and Plato were alive at the same time. We had the inventors of drama and comedy. Names that you've heard: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. The people who invented the art form of drama in the exact same way we still do it now, 2,500 years later. We're still performing those same plays that these people wrote who were all alive in this small town at the same time. We had the people who invented history, the professional writing of history, names that you've heard before, Herodotus and Thucydides, alive in this small town at the same time. We had mathematicians, philosophers, Zeno, Meno, Anaxagoras, Protagoras. You've heard these names before. Anaxagoras was the person who looked up at the sun one day and said, I don't think that that's Zeus riding in a chariot across the sky. I think that the sun is a big ball of fire. These were the kind of people who were alive and for the first time exploring their world. These were the people who invented democracy. Pericles, the great statesman, was alive at this time. How did this happen? The Persians invaded Greece at the beginning of the century. You've all heard of the marathon, right? The 26-mile race. Well, Marathon is a town that's 26 miles from Athens. And when the Persians invaded, this one young man ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to tell everybody about it, and he collapsed at the end and died. But the Greeks organized themselves, and they went and they expelled Persia from their land. And lots of Greek cities joined up together to do this. But the two principal cities were Athens and Sparta, who emerged as the leading cities expelling the Persians from Greece. So then the big question was, what's going to happen now? Are Athens and Sparta going to go at each other? Well, they didn't. They signed a peace treaty. Essentially, Athens said, we'll take this half of Greece, Sparta, you take that half of Greece, and we'll just live in peace. And it was in this era of peace that the golden age of Athens emerged. I want to talk a little bit about their democracy. It was a pure democracy. It wasn't even representative democracy. It was a democracy where everyone was expected to participate. Now, I want to put a little footnote on that everyone, because I'm going to come back to it in a minute, because it wasn't actually everyone. We'll get back to that in about 5 or 10 minutes. But when I say everyone, I mean free male citizens. And I bet you can all guess where I'm going to head with this talk a little later. Now, the legislature met every 9 days in a big open forum in Athens on the Acropolis. And everyone was expected to show up. In fact, they would go into the marketplace, the agora, and just literally herd people into the assembly. So you'd have thousands of people in there. Most leadership positions were done simply by lottery. You just pick a name out of a hat, and no leadership position lasted more than 1 year. Everyone was expected to participate, and everyone was expected to take their turn being a leader. And Pericles was the great statesman who believed in democracy and believed in free speech and pushed this system. And they elected him every year as their archon, as they called it. Now, this was also the time when Greece built the Parthenon. Some of you have seen the Parthenon on TV. A couple of you maybe have traveled to Greece. That glorious columned building, one of the greatest pieces of architecture of all time, was built during this golden age of Greece. And we have copied this Greek architecture ever since. Here we are now, throughout all of civilization around the world, still copying these institutions, copying their philosophy, their architecture, their democracy, their justice. The whole notion of a trial by jury they invented in that century. The Athenians had a goal. They had a goal to create a perfect society. They had all these geniuses living together. They were all going to be equal, and they were going to create a perfect society. And you have to realize this was being done in a world where everyone around them were barbarians. Every city around them and every city that had lived prior to them had been run by a tyrant, a single powerful person who ran the city. There was no such thing as the rule of law. It was all simply might makes right. Powerful people ran things, and that's how it went. So this was an enormous step forward for the Athenians. Now the story gets complicated. When I say that they thought of all of themselves as equal, well, actually it was just a segment of the population that thought of themselves as equal. Free male citizens. In Athens at this time, more than half the people were slaves. Of the perhaps 400,000 or 500,000 people, let's use the round number of 500,000 people living in greater Athens, the estimate is about 300,000 of them were slaves. Slavery had existed in all societies throughout all of time prior to this, so this wasn't unusual that Athens was doing it. Now, of the 200,000 free people, half were women. Well, the women were not actually allowed to participate in their various public institutions. So now you're down to 100,000. Of the 100,000, not all of them were citizens. Being a citizen of Athens was a very difficult threshold. Both of your parents had to be citizens, not even if just one were. And there was almost no way of gaining citizenship. So they really kept it very small club of who could be in. So this cut it in half again. You had about 40 or 50,000 free male citizens out of 500,000 people. And it's that group of people who said, hey, you know what? We're all equal. We're all going to participate in these public institutions. Now, standing here today, we look at that and we say, boy, it's really clear that something was wrong there. But you have to realize that back then, that was, in its own way, an enormous leap forward. To go from societies where there was one powerful tyrant king who ran everything to saying, well, there's 50,000 of us and we're all equal, that is a conceptual step forward. The question is just, when are you going to make the next conceptual step forward and say, okay, wait a minute, it's really everybody. I want to talk for a second about these institutions. They all looked remarkably similar, which is interesting. And what I mean is this. Their jury system, anyone who wanted to could sit on a jury, whoever was interested in that case. So you might have 6,000 people sitting in a jury, and it was kind of a form of entertainment. And it looked very similar to their legislature. So two people would present their case, everyone would listen, and then they would vote. Who was guilty, who was innocent, or who was right, who was wrong. So you might have a vote of 4,000 to 2,000 or something on a jury, and then you would have your result. And the Greeks were very pure about this in the beginning, and they felt they were creating justice, and they were going to find justice. And so the legislature then was very similar. And their theater was very similar. 5,000 or 6,000 people would come to the theater and watch a play by Sophocles or Euripides or somebody. And the plays were all tragic drama where great moral questions were debated. So you would go to the theater and you would hear these debates of moral questions, and then you would go to sit on a jury where you were addressing a real life question. So the theater was seen as practice, as education for being in the legislature or being on a jury. And in fact, you really weren't supposed to vote in the assembly if you hadn't been going to the theater. Isn't that interesting? Like you hadn't done your homework. So here you have this same group of people going from one institution to the next and trying to create a perfect society. And Athens got richer and richer, and they built beautiful temples. And they're engaging in their philosophy. I mean, this is a town that loved knowledge so much that someone like Socrates could just go sit down in the marketplace and just start talking. And pretty soon there'd be a crowd gathered around him. And 2,500 years later, we're still studying what he said. And people will spend their entire lives trying to understand Plato, who wrote down what Socrates said. So then you say to yourself, what happened? How did they lose all of this? Well, I think they paid a cost. They paid a price by not allowing all of the voices in their society to participate in their institutions. So let's see what happened. In the year 432 BC, the Parthenon was finished. This glorious, beautiful building. Athens was finished. It was the most magnificent city ever built on the earth to that point. In fact, people say it was more beautiful and glorious than Rome ever was at its height. And Pericles, who loved democracy, who was a great patron of the arts, had unmet ambition. And it was kind of like, gee, what's next? Now what do we do? And meanwhile, over the past 20, 30 years, this peace alliance with Sparta had been developing friction, kind of just bothering each other a little bit and arguing about who was trading with who in what island and so forth, and things just got more and more tense. And Pericles finally called a big assembly, 432 BC, and the issue was, should we go to war with Sparta? Greece just isn't big enough for the two of us, so to speak. And we've got unmet ambition. Now, it might surprise you to hear, it surprised me when I learned this recently, Socrates actually didn't like democracy. I was kind of startled when I learned that. I said, wait a minute, Socrates, that's Socrates. He's the great genius. So he didn't like democracy? Well, he didn't like the democracy that he was seeing right in front of his eyes when he was alive. Not the same sense that we have of democracy now after 2,000 years of developing it. He looked at democracy as mob rule. You know, a bunch of men get in the room and shout about something and agree. Why should we think they've come to the right conclusion? And his little expression was, numbers are not knowledge. You know, why is it right? Because the majority of people happen to agree to it on this particular day. So in this assembly, they voted for war against Sparta. And not to be confused with any other wars that might have happened in history that had a just cause, or you were fighting evil or something like that. This was a war for no good reason. This was, gee, you know, we've run out of things to do, let's go fight Sparta. Now, the war lasted for 30 years. And boy, did they go at each other. Athens was better in the sea, and Sparta was better on land. And they fought, and they fought, and they fought. Meanwhile, the public institutions in Athens that people loved so much started to be corrupted a little bit. They kind of lost their true belief in these things. And what I mean is, for instance, in their courts, in their judicial system, people started filing spurious lawsuits. It wasn't about a great search for justice anymore. It was people realized, hey, you know, I can sue my neighbor and get money out of it. Once they had kind of created this institution, people started to abuse it. So there were lots and lots of lawsuits. Someone would accuse somebody of something, and all you had to do is get in front of whoever showed up that day on the jury and give a better speech than the next guy. And if you won, you'd get some sort of award, or you'd get a fine paid to you, or whatever. So it became a great sport to sue each other, and everybody was suing each other. Kind of sounds a little familiar to today. And people would hire professional speech writers So they'd give a better speech than the other guy. And we still have some of those speeches. You know what's wonderful about this? If any of you become interested in studying that history, we have so much. We have Herodotus' history, we have Thucydides' history, we have speeches that were given in these assemblies, speeches that were given in the law courts, we have all the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes. We have so much to draw upon about that society if any of you become excited to study more about it. But anyway, these people that would pervert the law, the judicial system, were called sophists. You've heard that term before. And the great goal of a sophist was to make the worst argument sound like the better argument. So they kind of lost all interest in truth. Meanwhile, the war continues. And Sparta got the upper hand. In fact, several times Sparta came to Athens and said, hey, do you want to sign a peace treaty again? Have you had enough? Sparta kind of kept slowly winning. But there was nothing inside Athenian society that would allow them to accept peace. Oh, there would occasionally be short periods of peace, but the war would break out soon again. So after 30 years, in 404 BC, Sparta finally had Athens completely surrounded. They had completely taken all of the outside parts of greater Athens, and they were right at the walls of the city now. An enormous army led by a man named Lysander, Spartan general named Lysander. You can read all about him in Plutarch, by the way, if you get excited about that. Plutarch, the Roman historian. So Lysander has Athens surrounded, and they tore down the walls of Athens, and the Golden Age was over. So these geniuses who started 50, 60 years earlier and wanted to create a perfect society, invented democracy, invented a justice system, invented theater and philosophy and science, were completely wiped out by the Spartans by the end of the century. And we wonder, why did that happen? Well, I think they were missing something in their society. I think they were missing something that has taken us 2,500 years to develop, which is a set of core principles, a set of values that we go to so that on any given day we can't be influenced by one particular legislature or one particular jury. And it's not just mob rule, and it's just not just the emotions of the moment. We call them human rights now. I don't think they used that term back then, or whatever your favorite term is, civil rights, or in the United States we're all familiar with our own Bill of Rights, but it's a set of core principles that you never move away from. And you can't, it doesn't matter if a majority of people vote such and such on a jury or in a legislature, you can't move away from core principles. Core principles such as no slavery, everyone's equal, innocent until proven guilty, that you never torture someone, ever, freedom of worship, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, all these rock-solid principles. It can't be taken away. What if the legislature in Athens had been truly representative of the whole population? What if women were in the legislature, watching their sons die, fighting a useless war with Sparta? How would they have voted? Differently, I suspect. What about poor people, which in that day meant being a slave? How would they have voted? Was there anything in this war for them? Nothing. They were just doing all the hard work. So I think Athens suffered by not including all of its voices in its public institutions. I think Athens suffered by not having rock-solid principles to fall back on, no matter what the whim of the legislature was at that moment. And we can't fault them so much for that. Let's face it, it's taken us thousands of years to develop those principles. I mean, we can applaud them for their extraordinary achievements and advances, and then we can look at it and say, well, what was missing? I think there's a lot of lessons for us today to realize that our own public institutions, our legislatures, our judicial system are delicate, they're fragile. They don't just work magically. Just because you put a bunch of people in a room does not magically mean you get justice or you get the right law or the right decision. These are delicate institutions that take a lot of work. You have to have citizens in the room who are knowledgeable, who have spent their lives developing their own core principles, who believe in truth, who believe in justice, and then democratic processes can yield the right results. All of you are here today. I applaud that. That means all of you are educating yourselves and curious and attending all these events all week so that you'll be great citizens, so that you can participate in making public institutions of our country work. And that's about all I have to say. I'm happy to, I think we're going to do a little bit of Q&A, I was told. Where's Tony? There's Tony. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to talk about them.
Thank you, Greg. Do you have my microphone? What I'm going to do is I'm going to come around with the microphone so we get it on TV. We're being broadcast in other places, so I'll rush the microphone down to me. And may I say, Paul, to bring the microphone, that Greg Carter is a wonderful human being who has dedicated himself to one major issue, that is the dignity of all people and human rights. And we are very, very grateful, Greg, that you came again today. And he is spending his life doing this. And I want to say that he is really changing the face of Idaho. He gave $500,000 to help build the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, the only one in the United States. He has given $1 million to help us create a first-class human rights center in Coeur d'Alene, and Mary Lou Reed is chairing that committee, and we have a wonderful board. He's done a lot for his hometown, and he's building a theater in Cambridge. And, you know, he's shy, and he doesn't want me to say this, but I'm going to anyway. And he is knowing theater is a way to teach human rights. He is a man who has his heart in the right place, and say thank you to him. How lucky Idaho is. Now with that, we'll have questions. And he has, okay, right here we go.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, Greg.
Hi, Marilyn.
Wonderful to have you here. And I would like to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you see theater as a workshop for democracy. Because I know there must be a very strong connection between your interest in human rights and your interest in the theater. Please.
Thank you. Well, and I'm going to expand on the concept of theater a little bit too in response to your question. You have to realize or to think about the fact that 2,500 years ago in Athens, there was no TV, there was no movies, there was no radio, there was no recorded music. So theater was everything. It was the art form. It was the place where you got together and publicly expressed your values in an art form. And that's why theater was so enormously important for them. Now we can expand our definition a little bit. And for us, it can be all of our public expression of art. So it can be our movies, it can be theater, it can be our television programs and so forth. So I think what you're driving at, Marilyn, is a very interesting question, which is what is the interaction between arts and human rights? So I'll take a crack at that from a couple of different angles, and then you probably have a better answer than I do anyway, so maybe I'll turn it back to you. But what is the intersection between art and human rights? A couple of things. One is this. Human rights rests on one core belief, and that is that all humans have dignity. Every human being. You see, every genocide, every evil that takes place in the world, one of the strategies of the evil leaders is always to try to say that some people don't count. Well, they're not entirely human, so it doesn't matter what we do to them. They're a different religion than we are. They're a different color than we are. They're from this other place, so you know what? They don't count. All that really counts is just these people that look just like me or think just like me. So it's okay that we do these bad things to these others. It's that strategy of dehumanizing that is always perpetrated by evil dictators. And the core human rights belief is that every human being has dignity, every human being has value, and that you can't take away someone's humanity. And that speaks to the overall theme of your entire week of your popcorn forum, Tony, eliminating hate. Because that's the strategy of evil dictators, is to make you hate someone because they're different than you are. I think what the arts do is the arts define what is this dignity we're talking about. The arts give dignity to human beings. A great movie, a great play, a great love song on the radio, or what touch our hearts. Because human rights is a very funny kind of social science because it's the combination of intellectual activity and emotional activity. Now, a lot of science tries to not have any emotional activity because they don't think it's helpful to just doing pure science. But human rights is different. You have to combine love of other people. You have to combine compassion for other people, altruism. You have to combine these emotional parts of your being with your intellectual parts of your being to make the right decisions. So I see the arts as very important in creating that humanity within us. I see arts as important in helping us to understand suffering that others bear. A great work of art is a way for one human being to share what's in her or his soul so that you can feel it inside your soul. And if that other person is suffering, and then you can understand that suffering communicating through the medium of art, then it makes you more humane and it makes you care more about them. So I do see an enormous connection between the two. And there's other interesting connections. The Greeks had a term called catharsis, you've all heard, a kind of a purging. Sometimes the arts can help us do that. When just injustice has been done and when evil has been perpetrated, we can sometimes heal ourselves with art. One of the greatest documentary films that I have ever seen, and Tony, we should help you find a way to play it here, is called Amandla, A-M-A-N-D-L-A. And it's a documentary film that was made in South Africa during the apartheid regime when as we all know, the blacks suffered terribly. And for years and years and years, the one method of communication that the blacks had, one, let's call it, way of showing their resistance was through their music. And there would be these funerals. There would be freedom fighters. There would be black South Africans who would fight against the evil, racist white regime, and the black freedom fighters would be killed. And then there would be a funeral. And the whole community would show up from that young person, and they would all start to sing. And they would sing these beautiful songs that would raise their spirits and would allow them to feel community and connection and that we're in this together. Because human beings are a social species. We feel the connection to others, and moral behavior takes place in groups. And this documentary film goes around from one place to another in South Africa and shows these various repressed and suppressed people and freedom fighters singing their songs with beautiful lyrics. And it's just extraordinary. I think we'll have to find it, and we'll get you a copy of it. I think you should play it here someday. So I guess, Mary Lou, I see a lot of important connection between art and human rights. And I don't know if I've answered your question, or do you have a follow-on, or?
That was great. Next question. Over here we go. This is how I get my exercise during this week. I will, thanks.
Hi, my name's Kirk Thompson.
Hi.
I want to thank you for being here too. My question is kind of a two-part question. You were talking about the jury trial and how it originated in Athens and stuff like that. Do you believe that everybody in this country deserves a right to a fair and speedy and a jury trial if they so choose, right?
Yeah.
Now, I was just wondering, because you had donated the land, or you had bought the land that the Aryan Nations compound was on, and you gave it to NIC. What I was wondering is that, and I want to make this clear, I do not really care for, I'm glad that the Aryan Nations are gone, and being Hispanic, nothing thrills me more than to see them away from here. They used to live about 3 miles away from me, and I didn't really like that much. But if you had a sense that their trial was not fair, and they were not given the right to a really fair trial, would you have stood up for them just as much as a black person, or a Hispanic person, or something like that?
Your question is a great question, and we can all take a moment here to think through the implications of it. Was it Eric? Kirk, sorry. We can all take a moment to think through the implications of Kirk's questions, because it's one of those fabulous questions that you can learn so much by thinking about and by wrestling with. In a society, if we claim that we believe in a free trial for everyone, a fair trial for everyone, then every so often can we just decide, oh, well, we're not going to do it this time? I think that's the heart of your question. If we believe in core principles, then we cannot every so often just decide to ignore them. And nothing expresses more perfectly a belief in justice and a belief in a judicial system than to give the Aryan Nations people a fair trial. That's what makes our society extraordinary. If we don't do that, then how can we say we're really any different from some other society? If it turns out that, well, we like justice, but we just kind of like justice for, people we like, and we won't bother with the others. And it can be very frustrating sometimes to watch judicial procedure when you feel in your heart you know someone's guilty, and you're watching this and you're saying, this is just, he gets to have this trial and it goes on for months, and look how expensive it is, and I don't even, he's bringing these witnesses forward, and I don't even think they're telling the truth, and they're claiming he's the model citizen, and we all know he's not. It can be really frustrating sometimes. But we have to realize that we are protecting a system system that has to deliver justice to all of us. And so my answer to your question is we absolutely have to give the Aryan nations a fair trial. And if you thought that, whatever, some judge had been bribed or some rules had not been followed, or if you thought that someone from the Aryan nations had been tortured, for instance, in prison to get a confession out of him, that's wrong. We may not like the guy, it has nothing to do with it. Torture is wrong, and that means that confession could not be used in court. So your question is a brilliant and fabulous question, and it's an important one. But we have to believe in the system, and sometimes it's even frustrating.
Next question, please. Yes.
Hi. How many years have you been involved with human rights, and what made you decide to get involved with it?
Tony came to me in a dream one day, and
I'm glad to hear that.
let's see. I guess it was in 1995. I met a man named Harry Wu, and he was then a Chinese American citizen, but he had been born in China and had spent 19 years in prison as a political prisoner, starting in, I guess, about 1960 to 1979, something like that. The dictator, Mao Zedong, in order to control his society better, rounded up anybody that he thought was even remotely dangerous to his regime, and he threw them all in prison. So Harry Wu and hundreds of thousands of other college students and people who had done nothing wrong were thrown into these labor camps. And Harry got out in 79 after Mao was dead and things had changed a little bit, and he made it to America and stayed, and he wrote a book, which I recommend to all of you, called Bitter Winds, B-I-T-T-E-R, Bitter Winds. And I read the book, and I interviewed Harry because I was writing a book a review about that book. So that's why I met him. And you know, I was just really overwhelmed with this sense of you know, that could have happened to me. And I think that's the big moment when we turn to human rights, when you realize how lucky and fortunate we are, and how, you know, I was a college student, so I was no different than Harry Wu at age 20, so I could have been rounded up and thrown in prison for 19 years. It's that big feeling of it could have happened to me. It's that feeling of connection to all other humans on Earth. It's that feeling that, well, if this is happening to someone in the world somewhere today, how can I not be involved? And you know, I used to think, I used to imagine, well, what would it be like if I were in a labor camp for 19 years? And this was a terrible, terrible situation. I mean, at least half of them starved and died. I mean, it's amazing that Harry made it out alive. I mean, they were freezing in the winter and working in coal mines and getting nothing to eat and so forth. And I always imagine, what would it be like for me if I were in a predicament like that? And I always thought to myself, you know, there's probably only one thing that would keep me going. And that one thought would be that maybe someone somewhere is imagining me and cares. You know, maybe someone in America or someone somewhere care. I mean, what if I were a political prisoner, had been a political prisoner in an Iraqi jail for the last 10 years because I had said the wrong thing about Saddam Hussein? I mean, what would keep you from just killing yourself? It would be the idea that someone somewhere cares. And that would probably be the one light that you could keep on. I asked Harry why he didn't commit suicide, and he said that. He said, you know, I just kept a small light on. So I guess it's just a feeling of connection to other humans and wanting to see if there's anything I can do to make a difference.
What great questions. Our students they're very special, you know.
Absolutely. They're Idahoans.
They're Idahoans, you bet. Now we'll turn to the faculty. I see one back here.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Trainer. I'm a history instructor here. And I have a question for you. I also consider myself a huge advocate for human rights. There are some issues that are very prevalent right now in this country, including the treatment of the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and the Patriot Acts, one and possibly a second. And I was wondering if you could comment on either of those topics.
It's a great question, and it's thematically connected in some ways to Kirk's very good question. We have prisoners that we took in Afghanistan that are now in a prison camp that we control in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. Now, the question is, how do we treat those prisoners? Even if we assume that they're bad people. The question is, how do you treat them? It's my opinion that we should treat them according to what's called the Geneva Convention, which is a set of rules and norms and laws and procedures that you use for treating prisoners of war. Now, I'm going to pose this as a question today because we're in an auditorium, we're at a college, we're at a place for learning and questioning, and I don't ever like to think I'm the person with all the answers. I like to think that we get together and we raise interesting questions, and then we learn. So I'll pose it as a question, not an answer, as to should it bother us if we, America, don't give those prisoners in Guantanamo Bay the rights under the Geneva Convention. Now, we saw on TV a couple days ago that the Iraqi regime had captured some British soldiers, and it appears that they shot them right in the head. Now, once you've captured someone and they're no longer a threat to you and you've disarmed them, then they're supposed to have rights as prisoners of war. You treat them humanely. Yes, of course, you can put them in prison, but you treat them humanely. They get some food. They get access to the Red Cross. But once you've disarmed someone, you don't go and shoot them in the head. And our information may not be perfect, but it appears that that's what happened, maybe to some British and maybe to some American POWs. Now, when we see that, it enrages us as civilized beings. Now, we aren't doing that kind of evil to anyone in Guantanamo Bay. People in Guantanamo Bay are treated with some level of dignity, and no one's being, and if they need medical attention, they get medical attention. No one's being tortured, to my knowledge. The people are getting 3 meals a day. So it's not evil in that way. But there is a principle involved. And the principle, we always have to be careful when we violate a principle, because then it gives someone else the excuse to violate a principle. So if we ever have a prisoner in our control and we don't say, you will get the rights of a POW under the Geneva Convention, even if we're still treating them pretty well, if we don't say you will get those rights, it gives someone like the Iraqis an excuse to say, well, why should we treat your POWs well? You aren't giving the Geneva Convention to your people in Guantanamo Bay. And that's the scary thing. And that's why we need to be careful about always as the United States needs to live up to international human rights standards. And it's more than just saying, well, gee, we know we're good people and blah, blah, blah. It's more than that. If we don't live to the letter of the standard, you weaken the system, and then other nations that are truly evil nations can take advantage of that. So that's you raise an important question and something to be seriously thought about.
Thank you. Back here.
Good morning, Mr. Carr.
Hi, it's nice to see you. I think you might be the president of this institution.
Yes, sir. I'm Michael Burke. I'm the president of North Idaho College, and I'm also the proud owner of the property formerly known as the Aryan Nation Compound, and I want to thank you for that generosity and that gift. And recently I had the opportunity to walk around that property with our foundation director, and you graciously agreed with Tony's help to turn that property back to a beautiful hillside in North Idaho. And as I walked around there, I could still, in my mind, imagine what was there, what had been there. Tony and I visited it when it was still had buildings on it. And I guess I'm still concerned and still bothered by the fact that young people were there, people the age of many of our students in this room, whose hearts were changed and filled with hate and racism and intolerance. And one day they're going to wake up, my age, and realize that their lives have been wasted. And I guess my question to you is, I'm appalled by that loss of human potential, I suppose. And do you see any hope in the recovery of that lost potential? Do you see any way to change the human heart in this situation?
It's a great question. I think that having this forum every year with, 44 events this time on several different campuses, inviting everybody. I think Tony said there's more than 100 speakers. I think that public education is an everyday struggle at every part of society. I know that you have a Human Rights Foundation here. There's a very active one in Boise. And I know together they work on K through 12 education, for instance, so that right in the beginning, young people start learning these lessons. I have a, 10-year-old niece who goes to elementary school in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and I went to her classroom once, and there were all these posters up all around the wall from different countries all around the world, and they had engaged in some sort of exercise of imagining what it was like to be an Argentine or an Eskimo or a whatever. And I realized that what's going behind that we're starting very young, and we're teaching people to care about others, and to care about people that live far away, and to care about people that look differently than we do, and to imagine them as human beings, and to understand, gee, that could be me, or he could be who I am. And I think you have to start very early, and then as people learn and grow and get more sophisticated, then you start having events like this with more challenging questions like the ones we've had. It's very sad to imagine that, and the point is, if you're doing all of that, then I think some 20-year-old kid is less vulnerable to the philosophy of a Richard Butler. You want people so they're not in a position of even being vulnerable to believing in terrible racist stuff or so forth. If people at different times in their life are vulnerable. You find yourself in your 20s, you're unemployed, maybe you're just getting out of prison, you have no self-esteem, somebody comes along and says to you, you're better than everybody just because of how you look. You're vulnerable to believing stuff like that. So you have to start early. And as to your very difficult question, well, what about someone who's already been part of that? I think I've seen and heard some amazing efforts of reaching out to this community. And I think, Tony, don't you interact with some of these young people?
Thank you, Greg. Yes, we have. One of the experiences we've had that's been very, very rewarding is that there have been a number of what we call racist skinheads who through some bad experiences they had, decide to leave, oftentimes with fear. And I guess, for lack of a better term, they go through something called deprogramming. And I've had some really wonderful conversations. I recall, and I've done a lot of talk radio interviews, and they'll be on there a lot of times, and they'll turn around. And those conversations are very revealing. And Greg, you are so correct that how they've got brought into that movement has been some things you talked about, where maybe they've been alienated from their families, they've lost their self-esteem, and what the hate groups have done is tried to use scapegoating and say, what's happened to you is the fault of, and then identify groups such as anti-Semitism, the Jewish community. But when they come out of that, sometimes they become real missionaries and evangelistic for human rights. And one of them works for the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. So there are situations where there's real hope. But for the next question, I just want to do one thing. And again, this really ties to Greg Carr. I'm really enjoying this, Greg, and you're doing a marvelous job. And these questions are fabulous. But Greg is also supporting staff people to work in human rights, and we have some special people in the audience. One of them is the executive director of the Idaho Human Rights Education Center in Boise, and also it's where the Anne Frank Memorial is located. Would you please stand? Les Bach.
Hey, Les.
Also, Greg has been very generous to helping the Association of Idaho Cities, and we have a full-time employee with the Association of Idaho Cities to work in the cities all over the state in human rights, and he's been here all week, Michael Shaw. And our wonderful friends from Gonzaga University, and Greg has not had a chance, I think, to meet them yet, but I believe I'm correct to say that the only college in this entire country that has developed an organization to study hate, and in fact, they're going to have a baccalaureate degree in dealing with this problem, and we have their executive director, the Gonzaga University Institute for Action Against Hate, Jerry Shepard. And from the law school, I know what I speak. He was the driving force behind creating this institute, teaches law at the law school, George Critchlow. Now we have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
Thank you. My name's Giuseppe Romano. I'm a student here at NIC. You mentioned in your talk, your speech about the Greek society and the sophits, the enormous amount of lawsuits that there were, frivolous lawsuits, it seemed. And you tied that into today's society of the many frivolous lawsuits we have. And it got to me thinking, and a lot of these frivolous lawsuits, or so they seem frivolous, are civil lawsuits. You know, he said something that offended me or took away my civil rights, and a lot of these may seem a little questionable. And in today's society, we go to certain lengths to be politically correct. Some think too far. So it's kind of a two-part question. Do you think we've gone too far? And if, going too far may restrict, we're too scared to talk about things because we're afraid to offend somebody. And if we have gone too far, if we reach the point where we're so worried about whether or not we're offending someone, what can we do you think, to remedy that situation?
It's great question. Again, it's a question that isn't going to have an answer for this morning. It's one of those questions where you want to carefully set out the various debates because it will start your mind on a process of thinking that you might spend years and years and years working on because you're trying to strive for a delicate balance. I sometimes think of an analogy in my mind of this. Every year in this country, I'm just using round numbers, I don't have actual statistics by any means, but every year in this country we give millions of flu shots. And it's great because it means that millions of people don't get the flu who might get it. But every year there's 2 or 3 cases of some sort of adverse reaction, someone's allergic or something, and they die. So here you go in to get a flu shot, thinking, well, okay, I won't get the flu this year, and you die. Now, you step back and you go, well, wait a minute, that's not good at all. Maybe we better just not do these flu shots anymore. But as a society, you kind of... You know, if someone dies of a flu shot, you say, never again in this entire country are we ever giving a flu shot? Usually you don't do that. Usually the response is to try to improve the system. Can we change the flu shot a little bit so that people with a certain kind of allergy don't react? You know, I think that if someone files a spurious lawsuit and they lose, and the judge throws it out because it's clearly spurious, well, that doesn't help that person. They've wasted their time, they've wasted their money. You know, so there's a price to be paid for a spurious lawsuit. So I guess what I'm saying is these are big, complicated systems, and they're only going to work as well as the people who are participating. And if the people are just and honest and are not trying to corrupt the system for their personal gain, but truly believe in the system. And it's an everyday effort to educate people to care that way and think that way.
One more question. And this gentleman back here has his hand up 2 or 3 times. Just now saw him. You know?
Morning.
Morning.
My question lies along the same lines of Giuseppe's. I don't remember exactly when this was, but I remember hearing something about the United States being voted off of a Human Rights Council, like a World Council. You know what I'm talking about. I heard a commentary about that where a lady said that her opinion on this was that we've been voted off, we shouldn't help. If they don't want our help, we don't get it. So my question is, how would you respond to that? And is there such a thing as going too far? Giuseppe said, have we gone too far? I'm asking, is there such a thing as going too far in human rights and promoting that?
It's a great question. It's a great one to end on because I can turn it back into a big challenge for all of you. And there's kind of 2 parts to your question. There's the going too far part, and then there's sort of the more specific comment about the United States. So I'll take them in the order you presented them. Here's my challenge to all of you. The United States is a very curious animal regarding human rights. And my challenge is to all of you to spend as much time as you have and as much interest as you have trying to figure this out, because it's a complicated puzzle. We are sometimes the friend and sometimes the foe of international human rights as a country, and it's a curious thing. We basically invented human rights. I mean, after World War II, the United States led the worldwide commission that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was led by Eleanor Roosevelt, and our government and our people were foursquare behind it. And in many ways, we've always been a shining light to the world in human rights. And we're very proud of our own civil rights. And civil rights is the term we use within the United States, and human rights is generally the term when you're talking about international norms. And ironically, because we're so good at civil rights, we're often not very good at human rights. In other words, we pay less attention to how we're behaving internationally because we feel that we do it so well here at home. And that's a blind spot for America. And it's a tough, tough question. There's a lot of human rights treaties in the world that we haven't signed, that other nations have signed, and you have to say, well, why? Now, I'm not going to present it so simply here today to say that there may not be a good reason on the other side. I'll present it as a challenge to try to figure out what are the 2 sides of the argument. Now, the United States has not supported the creation of an international criminal court, and almost every other nation in the world has. And this international criminal court would be used for trying people who commit genocide. Now, you can all go away today and wonder why we didn't sign it. And it's complicated, and it would take 20 hours to discuss it, and we still wouldn't be done, so I can't even begin. We don't always support international human rights in this country. There are those of us, like myself, who think we should do more than we do. We're sometimes the last country to sign various human rights treaties. On the other hand, I'm a great patriot, and I'm proud of this country, and I love this country. And our civil rights tradition has been a model for the world. It's one of those situations where however well you think you're doing something, you can always challenge yourself to do better. And we can do better as a country. Now, the second part of your question, can you ever go too far? It is a similar question to the one asked over here. And the answer is yes, of course, you could go too far. It's a balance. Life is a complicated balance. And you don't want the medicine to kill the patient, to go back to my analogy with the flu shot. And if on the one hand you believe in free speech, and on the other hand you think it's a crime to harass someone, well, guess what? You've got two concepts that hit right in the middle, don't they? So what do you do about that? Well, those are the kind of complicated questions that you can spend your lifetime thinking about. Everyone would agree on the general proposition that there's a point where free speech stops when it starts hurting someone else. If you phrase the question in loose, vague terms, then we can all agree. But then when you start to say, oh, okay, but where's that line? Then everyone disagrees on where the line is. And that's why we all have to look to our own hearts, develop ourselves, be just, care about others, try to put yourself in the other person's shoes, and do your best day by day to answer these very complicated questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you leave, I have two things, please. First one is that I've been doing this from its conception of the Popcorn Forum, and I just don't know when I've heard any greater questions than today. And very importantly, I don't know when I've heard a speaker make you think more than Greg Carr has. The way he answers questions, he really challenges you to think about things that are always complex. He's a remarkable thinker. I have a favor to ask of you. At 11 o'clock, Dr. James Waller will be here from Whitworth College. He's written a book that's getting raving reviews called Becoming Evil. The reason I would love to have you hear him, he's a very good friend, and he's on the East Coast touring a book tour. He agreed to come home a day early to give this speech and then to go back to the East Coast. What a great gift to us that he was so generous to do that. So hope you'll come back at 11 o'clock and hear Dr. James Waller. This book is getting really a lot of attention, Becoming Evil. Again, Greg Carr, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.